Welcome to our final housing deep dive. My name is Marva Galilulu, and I'm the Learning and Member Engagement Specialist for SVCN. A few housekeeping items before we jump in. Next slide, please. First, as a continuing SVCN practice, I want to take a moment to acknowledge the land that each of us are on today. In San Jose, California, we are living, learning, and organizing on the land of the Muwekma and Tamian Ohlone tribes. Together, let us commit to educating ourselves and advocating for Indigenous peoples, communities neglected and displaced by the US government, and other colonial powers across the world. I know people here are tuning in from different areas, so I encourage you to learn what land you're living on by using the website we'll share in the chat and share the information in your introduction. While I continue to go through today's guidelines, we'd love to learn who is in the room with us. Please introduce yourselves in the chat by sending your name, title, and organization, pronouns, and native land. We will recap the items to share. Next slide, please. For accessibility purposes, we do have the automated closed captioning feature in Zoom activated. Now with this, you do have the ability to move the captions around your screen to a place more convenient, or you can disable the closed captioning feature entirely if you prefer to not have it up. To do so, please reference the bar at the bottom of your Zoom, click on Live Transcript on the right, and then click Hide Subtitles. If you're having any tech or other troubles during this session, please message Dana directly in the chat. Next slide, please. We do ask that you remain on mute throughout the program and use the chat to send questions. And with that, I'd like to pass it to Nick Kawada, Policy Director for SVCN.
Thanks, Marva. Hello, everyone. My name is Nick Kawada, Policy Director of Silicon Valley Council of Nonprofits. My preferred pronouns are he, him, and welcome to our final webinar in our SVCN's Housing A to Z series. Today, we will cover facts versus fears addressing Silicon Valley's housing crisis. In this session, we hope to address the bias and prejudice against people who are unhoused and need affordable housing. We'll discuss possible narrative shifts, as well as how to hold public officials who perpetuate harmful stereotypes and people with disabilities accountable. Matthew, I believe I'm handing it over to you.
Great, thanks so much. Welcome, everybody. I am Matthew Reed, the Director of Policy from SV at Home. We're really pleased to have people here for this discussion. I'm going to briefly introduce folks that are here to talk to each other and share with you their experience. We have David Lowe from Destination Home, Aaron Neff from the Law Foundation of Silicon Valley, Thomas Knight, who is part of the Lived Experience Advisory Board at Destination Home, and Elma, Arredondo, and Jaime Alvarado from the Alum Urban Village Advocates. And why don't we start by just going around and allowing people to talk a little bit about who they are, what their organization is, and then we'll go into some questions. David, I'm going to come back and give a little bit of structure, but why don't you introduce yourself a little bit?
Sure. Hi, everybody. I'm David Lowe. I'm with Destination Home, and I help run our policy and communications efforts. And for those who don't know, Destination Home's an organization committed to ending homelessness in Silicon Valley. So we work on a wide range of initiatives, from funding impactful strategies to advocating for new policies to incubating programs that help us try to make sure we have stable and safe housing for all of those vulnerable residents of our community.
Marvelous. Aaron?
Hi, my name is Erin. I'm a staff attorney at the Law Foundation of Silicon Valley. The Law Foundation functions in Santa Clara County to provide legal services to low-income individuals. We focus in the areas of housing, health, and representing children. I work specifically in the housing program, where I do eviction defense, policy work, and affirmative litigation to promote the rights of tenants.
Great. And Thomas?
Hello, my name is Thomas Knight. I'm humbled to be here. I appreciate the opportunity. I am a member of the Lived Experience Advisory Board as part of Destination Home, as well as an advocate for the unhoused, as well as mental health and criminal justice reform. Thank you again for allowing me to be here.
Absolutely. Welcome, Thomas. And Elma and Jaime.
Good afternoon. My name is Elma Arredondo, and I'm co-chair for Aruba, the Alum Urban Village Advocates. We are Alum area residents and business owners concerned with the lack of a robust development plan for the Alum Urban Village. Our development focus is between the 101 and 680 development of the village with a visionary inclusionary plan based on community input. We regrouped about 2 years ago and have been meeting regularly. We developed an equitable development plan in which the quality of life of its residents, such as housing, parking, environmental concerns, educational issues, preservation of culture, amenities, aesthetics, and consistency of design are addressed. We meet with developers where we evaluate their projects based on the priorities of our development plan. Jaime.
Hey, folks.
And Jaime is our co-chair.
Yeah, Elma and I are co-chairs. I'm a lifelong resident here in the East Side and tired of seeing development occur without any intention to preserve housing for working poor people here on the East Side and any part of town for that matter.
Great, marvelous. So this is the third in a series of housing policy topics that the Silicon Valley Center of Nonprofits has been sponsoring. Thank you. And the focus today is really to address the questions of bias and prejudice against people who are unhoused and folks who need affordable housing, and frankly, lower income communities around the city of San Jose, but really around the entire county and the region. So David, I wanted to start with you. A lot of us who are in this space are really feeling a shifting of the atmosphere, both within the community and frankly from elected officials. And this isn't a new problem, but it is in some ways going beyond homelessness. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about why you think this is different, what's going on, and how we need to understand it in order to be prepared to respond.
Yeah, thanks, Matthew, and thanks for all our SVCN colleagues for bringing us together to talk about this topic, because I think the dynamics we're facing are not new, but it is definitely worse. I've been in around local government working policy issues for more than a dozen years now, and it does feel different. And it's not that it hasn't been there, but it's just so these stigmas, these biases, these prejudices are becoming so much more pervasive, and it's not only infuriating, but it's really damaging. You alluded to homelessness, which is what the work we work in too. And, none of these things, none of these stereotypes I'm just going to listen to you are going to be new to you, right? Everyone is mentally ill or on drugs. The people want to live outside. Affordable housing is just going to ruin our neighborhood. So it's things we've heard before. And again, for all of us in this work, it makes our blood boil. But the thing that's really crazy is it's not just constrained to, that one lone wolf voice out there who wants to cause a ruckus, or the comments section of the Mercury News, which we should all never read. We're hearing this in the, in quote, serious policy debates. We're hearing it from a growing course of elected officials, neighborhood leaders, other people of influence and supposed credibility. And I think I really put to the reason for two real reasons why this is happening. One, and I think this is particularly true in our work around homelessness, the problem feels worse. It's more in our face, it's visceral, and people are searching for answers. That's the good part. But the problem with searching for answers is they play back on those old stereotypes or look for someone to blame, and they'll reach for that even when it's not true. And the second commingled factor is in our political climate, politicians have more incentive to keep pushing for it, right? Pushing for these narratives to blame because it's going to give them popular appeal. It resonates to people what they want to hear. They're looking for office, or whatever we want to call the Trump effect is, right? Where this casualness has just been more accepted. And it's really dangerous when we talk about stereotypes and fears, is because we know it has some natural appeal to people, right? These untruths, we all know they are, right? It kicks into something deep in our core that has been passed on from generations, and why we have to fight so much harder. And the reason I'm glad we're talking about it today is that I can see how it is becoming, these fear stereotypes are playing a bigger role in our policy decisions. Our policy decisions, our funding decisions everywhere. And so that's why I think when we have our group here together, I do think we're all uniquely in a place where we can try to address it, but we all have to start asking ourselves, how can we start pushing back against this before we're all led down to an area where we're not talking about real solutions anymore, or what's going to help the people we're trying to serve?
Yeah, agreed. I think it's easy when you're in the middle of it, or you're sitting in a meeting being angry about what people are saying and letting us down, in a sense that, even though we need to all be in this together, it doesn't feel like that. But it has real real life impact. And Thomas, I wanted you to talk a little bit about, how this has been something that's impacted your life and your work, and how this stigma is posing a challenge for you.
Yeah, I appreciate it. It's interesting to start. I have to give a little bit of background, because I wasn't born into this situation previous to 2017. I was married, had 4 kids, was successfully employed in the tech industry for 23 years. I did have some mental health diagnosis in my early 20s, but as far as I and everyone else was concerned, I was very well controlled until 2017, when I had a mental health break due to some undiagnosed PTSD, and attempted to take my own life, which failed and led instead into an unplanned for stay as a guest of the state of California in the California prison system. I was sentenced for 6 years, ended up serving 4 years and 1 month. And during that time, lost my marriage, lost my children, lost my reputation, lost my career, lost myself. And what I did gain was a complete and utter hatred for myself during that time. When I went to get out of prison, it was very interesting because I had nowhere to go. And so the state said, well, we'll help you with housing. But when I went to talk to the housing person, she said, well, what's your addiction? And I said, well, I don't really have an addiction. Like drugs and stuff weren't really part of my story. And she says, well, did you drink? I said, well, I would drink every once in a while. And she said, well, good. We'll put down here that you have an alcohol problem, because the only way we can put you into housing is if you have an addiction. And this is where these stigma and stereotypes, everything come in is, just before you can even get started getting help, in a lot of cases, you have to apply these stereotypes and stigmas to yourself, even to get the help that you're looking for. So I got out, they placed me in a sober living environment, and I was there for a couple of months until I had another mental health break due to the situation, the stress of all of it, and was hospitalized, which caused me then at that point to have a whole new stigma to me that ended my state funded housing. The SLE said that if you're too mentally ill, when we can't have you here, so we don't have anywhere else for you to go, but you can't be here. And so that led to a series of moves from SLE to different SLEs to the homeless shelter to the street, back to the shelter, wherever I could find a place to stay. During this whole time, I was trying to get on Social Security disability, as my treatment team was advising me to do. And that's a long process, as we all know, and eventually was denied. And everybody wanted me to fight it and keep going for that. But this is where, some real problems turned up, because I had nowhere to go. And in order to get help, to find housing, to find anything else, I needed to have employment. And that was the last thing my treatment team wanted me to do. But I ended up doing it anyways against their judgment, or best judgment and advice, but got work, and that the stigma plays into every part of your life when it comes to trying to get back on your feet again, right? Try applying for apartments and trying to find a place to live when you have no rental history for the last 5 years of your life, right? And the last thing you want to put down is, oh, I was renting a cell from the state of California, right? So when it came to going to work, right, I was in interviews. I had joined the Lived Experience Advisory Board, before this phase of where I was trying to find work, and I had it on my LinkedIn profile, and I was even in an interview one time and they brought up LEAB and asked me about it. And when I explained to them that it was, you know, for people with lived experience that had either previously or at one point had experienced homelessness, the entire conversation changed, the tone of the conversation changed. And it went from an incredibly good interview and incredibly good opportunity to, well, we'll call you, don't call us type situation. You know, so that that stigma affected the housing, affected the trying to find work, affected my social network, trying to actually have friends or family or relationships. And don't ever underestimate the stigma that we place on ourselves, right? The ability, you know, you know, that we get so used to living in that stigma, we don't believe we're good enough. We don't believe that we're, you know, eligible for any of that. So, you know, I did, with a lot of work and resiliency, I did get to work. I found work. I was able to get an apartment, you know, which in that course also caused me to lose my insurance, which caused me to lose my treatment team and my mental health medications. And so it's an interesting situation I'm in right now. This is all relatively recent. And I feel like I'm in a position where I've just gained all of this stuff in order to lose it all again, right? So, because I'm afraid, like, you know, this is going to take its course and not end well if I am not able to get through some of this and get the treatment and everything. So, you know, the stigma never ends. You know, it's always there, and I think that it's important for people to realize that people believe that people that are homeless or have these issues need treatment in order to then go out and get housing, right? Or in order to go out and get employment. And the truth is that if my situation would be different, if I would have been able to come out of prison and had housing first, if I would have been able to have stable housing, and then worry about my treatment, you know, I would have been set up for success instead of being set up for failure. And so, you know, I hope that people realize that there's reasons that stable housing is an important piece, and not an afterthought, right? It's the first thought, or should be the first thought. But so that's my situation. And like I said, you know, just remember that when you see people out there, you know, their story didn't start, you know, with living on the street. It didn't start with the problems that they have now, right? They, you know, they're somebody's son, they're somebody's father, they're somebody's, you know, daughter, wife, whatever. Anyways, that's my story. And I appreciate the opportunity to share with you guys here today.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think you point to the challenges of us just acknowledging our common humanity. I think, you know, periodically there's a moment of sort of goodwill in some of these public spaces where we all acknowledge that, you know, lots of our families and lots of us struggle with mental illnesses and addiction. And boy, it's a whole lot easier to manage those when you're in a stable place to live. And it's not really unique to folks that are living unsheltered. It's just that the barriers are pretty significant. And I'm sorry. I hear the frustration and the sense of never-ending struggle. And I think we can do better. So maybe this is a good place to bring some more folks into that discussion. Thank you, Thomas. Aaron, I want to talk about a kind of a real life policy question that's been particularly in San Jose, but we've been talking about questions of where we're going to build affordable housing in the future. Ideally to break down barriers around what have been previously exclusive neighborhoods. And this is a discussion that's happening on the state level, but in San Jose, it's really central to what we're calling the siting policy. And this is looking at where city money is going to be invested in building affordable housing in the future. And what started, again, as a concern that some areas were pulling more than their weight and that we wanted to open up opportunities to make some progress of expanding opportunities in areas that had previously been closed. But then it seems like it took an ugly turn, and it started to be talking about closing neighborhoods from investment because the neighborhoods themselves are, either too poor or already suffer from too much crime, and the stigmatization of folks moving into affordable housing, that there's an assumption that they would overburden local services. And we've just moved to a place where there's an assumption that affordable housing somehow equals crime and deterioration. Folks that need to figure out how to help themselves and maybe aren't deserving of our support, which again is contradicted in every study that's ever been conducted. But Aaron, supposedly this is all race neutral language and sort of in everybody's interests. But again, it's coming from folks that we count on to be progressive voices in cities like San Jose. And it feels, from being in the middle of it, like we're dangerously close to the kind of thinly veiled racist and classist talk that we're used to hearing in other smaller cities that we know are really opposed to creating opportunities. So it's a long-winded introduction. I'm wondering how you think we should be thinking about this. And what are some of the possible effects of the policy, but also the discussion around the policy that might be less obvious?
Sure, thanks, Matthew. And thank you again, Thomas, so much for sharing your story. I think in order to really understand the current citing policy and the seemingly race neutral assessments that's making and determining where housing should be located, it's first important to kind of step back and look at the history of segregation and discrimination in housing. So I have a few slides, thank you. So I think when we look at laws, and not just housing laws, but all laws in this country that at some point were just on its face racist, that said, only white people or no Black people, those laws have changed over time to be race neutral, but have the same impact. And when you evaluate these laws, you'll see that the Supreme Court will strike down these obviously racist laws. Meanwhile, the same people passing these laws, they get smart to it and they start changing the laws to race neutral laws. And then those are upheld by the courts. So so if we go to the next slide, we have some examples of that. And then so a quick example before getting into the ones in the slide is there were some neighborhoods in the country that said, okay, if you're Black, you can't live here. And then that law was struck down by the courts. And then the new law that was set up after that was, okay, if you're Black, if you're a person of color, you can live here, but only if you're eligible to marry someone else in the neighborhood. Well, interracial marriage was illegal, so that couldn't happen. So then that was connected to a non-race neutral law, and then that law was struck down. And then the next law after that might be, okay, you can live here, but only if everyone in the community agrees. Well, this all white neighborhood is not going to agree to that, but that seems more race neutral. Those are some like the more earlier iterations of how you see the evolution of racist laws become race neutral in the way that it's written. And over time, legislators, neighborhoods, racist advocates became more smart to this and wouldn't express their racist intentions behind laws and would write laws differently. So we also often think about racism and segregation in housing as something that was happening, in the 60s and prior to the 60s, but those are still happening today. And to use some examples that are very analogous to things that still happen today, there are a few in this slide here. So in the Chicago suburbs, there was zoning laws that only permitted multifamily housing in adjacent to commercial areas. This effectively continue to maintain segregation and perpetuate segregation. Anyone who's familiar with Chicago knows it's one of the most segregated cities in the country, just kind of block by block. The segregation is very entrenched. In Houston, a federal judge upheld zoning that allowed for hazardous waste sites in Black communities, because in the legislative history and the writing of the law, they couldn't prove that there was a racial motivation. The fact that all these hazardous waste sites were in Black communities didn't matter because there was no racist motivation behind it. 1991, not that long ago. I'm assuming everyone on this call is, was probably alive there during then. And we're seeing similarly landfills being built in Black neighborhoods. And when there was a proposal that a landfill be built in a white neighborhood, the neighborhood protested, so a permit was not issued. But that same courtesy wasn't provided to the Black neighborhoods. And again, it was because it was race neutral, and the impact of it or the intention behind it wasn't discriminatory, just the impact of it was. So I think everyone on this call can agree that that is, ridiculous. And that we need to not just look at the face of the law, the reasons why the law was passed, but what's the impact? At the end of the day, that's the most important thing, is the impact of the law, not necessarily just the plain language of the law. So over time, you have these race neutral laws, and then those laws, I'm sorry if you weren't around the early 90s, maybe I'm just aging myself. I remember 1991 like it was yesterday. To comment on a comment someone made in the chat. So these seemingly race neutral laws, over time become sort of, people I think forget the racist history of it, and then it just becomes policy, and it becomes these false facts that we get used to that become disconnected to its racist roots. And then so we start to perpetuate these poor zoning laws, these poor waste management laws, assuming that it's racist, and making assumptions about people wanting to live in certain neighborhoods that are not connected to the laws and structures that were put in place beforehand. Which brings me to my next slide. So for the affordable housing siting policy, the city is required to take all of this into consideration through affirmatively furthering fair housing, which is state law that passed that said we need to undo these historic wrongs, and not just the obvious on its face segregation, but look and assess about racial concentrations, lack of resources in different areas, too much resources in other areas, and assess all of these to make sure we have just policies. So if you want to turn to the next slide. So this is, so in an assessment of furthering fair housing, that's sort of the first bullet point there. These are the things that we need to take into consideration, which I just mentioned. As Matthew pointed out, the city has chosen to also assess violence as a factor in determining where affordable housing should be placed. However, nowhere in the affirmatively furthering fair housing law does it say that violence is a factor that needs to be assessed, except where it does bring up violence is it says specifically that policing and criminalization are contributing factors of segregation, racial concentration, disparities in opportunities, as well as disparities in opportunity for people with disabilities. So they're actually kind of doing the opposite of the state mandated law, and taking violence to say, why are we assuming that this area is violent? What is the over policing that's happening to designate this area as violent, and how do we reduce that issue? But instead they're saying this is violent, it's connected to affordable housing, more affordable housing can bring more of these violent community members in or entrench it. So they're really not really taking into consideration the racist history of designating people as violent. I mean, we see this all throughout history, saying like this racial group, well, we're racist against them because they're violent, because they're not as smart. And so it's really perpetuating this idea. And if we want to turn to the last slide that I have, the last point I'll make is that I think when assessing these issues, we need to stop these false facts and these false narratives, look at the real facts, and take into consideration, how do we create a just, affordable housing policy? So what I'll leave with you is this chart. So the city had looked at Second Street Studios, which is a permanent supportive housing development, I believe the largest in the country, that houses a lot of formerly homeless people. And they looked at it and they saw, since its creation, there's been an exponentially high increase of calls to 911. And the first full year of Second Street Studios' existence is 2020. And they looked at this and they had this graph and they were like, look at this, this is horrible. So they're saying there's too many resources being used and taken away from the community because of Second Street Studios. And this was all sort of put in a wider context of this violence narrative. So they pulled the public information from the San Jose Police Department and showed that, there were nearly 200 calls. So what I did was I pulled that exact same information, and instead of just looking and saying, okay, there are 200 calls, or specifically I'm looking at 190 calls, I looked at the reasons for the calls. And that's what's broken down in this graph here. So as you can see, the largest reason why people called the police, and so the area I looked at was the block and cross streets surrounding Second Street Studios. So it might not necessarily be connected to Second Street Studios, but that's how that's how the information's available. So if you see, the biggest call is loud music. The second biggest call was vehicle related. So these are car accidents, driving, parking violations, maybe driving without a license. The next one are alarms. And then the sort of smallest percentage, or one of the most smallest percentages, is actual violence. And then if you look at, I can't see this on my screen, but I hope you all can see this on your screen. But of these 190 calls, only 5 of them led to an arrest. A lot of them were canceled, were not substantiated. Some led to reports, some led to citations, but only 5 led to an arrest. And so again, this is just to sort of show you that this violence narrative, when we connect it to the history of racism, tells a very different story than the reality of the circumstances. And I'll end it with that and throw it back to you, Matthew.
Great. It's a lot to process. I really appreciate the work. I think it's very frustrating when these things get thrown around and are framed again to try and paint a particular picture. But the one that you noted with the Second Street Studios was one that was really prominent, unfortunately, at the San Jose City Council meeting when this citing policy came up, and it was used as presumptive that affordable housing was going to cause damage to neighborhoods because it was already damaging neighborhoods. And one has to wonder what it means that certain communities aren't really supposed to be using public services that exist, but it really painted a very stigmatizing picture at a time when we were trying to open doors. So I think the interesting thing about this moment is that we're in a kind of a reverse, that rather than people being shut out, people are sort of being opened up potentially to new areas, but in the process, we're kind of abandoning communities that we've decided are sort of unworthy of that investment. And the question is, where do you kind of tip the wrong way? And some of it is well-meaning and some of it is really unfortunate. But I'm glad we have Jaime and Elma here, because they've been really actively involved, and Aruba has been very actively involved. in this discussion. And frankly, it seems from the outside like, part of this is just policymakers and our elected officials are deciding that they know best what's in the interests of both individuals and communities. And I know that the Alum Rock Urban Village Advocates has been pretty outspoken about this. And you've submitted a very direct letter on the siting policy in San Jose. Maybe somebody can put that in the chat. So the question is, how does this all play out in your community? How do you understand what's happening? And what are the efforts to push back so that you have some control over resources to meet your needs? So I don't know if Elma, you want to jump in, or Jaime, you want to take this one?
I'll start. Aaron, thank you for that background. That's really good information. And thank you for both of you for referring to the siting policy. Siting as in S-I-T-I-N-G, like where to site, where to build affordable housing. Probably a more appropriate term for the way it's working out right now is like not the siting policy, but rather the let's no longer invest in affordable housing in working poor communities policy. What's happening is that the council and some of our best allies are really trying to build affordable housing in communities in San Jose that typically resist that. And so it's a good thing that we spread that around the city. Unfortunately, like Aaron was talking about, they're using so-called data to justify a policy that in the end, what's going to happen is that over time, all the city's affordable housing investment will go into parts of town that are considered highly resourced. That means people who live there are higher income and they have lower levels of crime. And of course, Aaron just pointed out that like the presentation of crime needs to be looked at more deeply, because in fact, when they characterize, Elma and I live in East San Jose. When they characterize East San Jose as a high crime area, certainly we have higher rates of crime than other parts of town, but a lot of that is crimes that are reported as Aaron detailed. They're nuisance things, and it's not like it's the gangs are taking over the entire community, right? So what's happening is that the proposal as it stands now, and the important thing is that there's still time to influence the city to not go down this road. But what they're considering right now is that over time, the vast majority of affordable housing investment will go into higher income communities in the city of San Jose. And that actually is the opposite of what we need. And I'm talking about East San Jose specifically, but this is true of all working poor communities in San Jose. What we need is more investment in working poor communities. And so, and we certainly have opportunities in the Alum Rock Urban Village. Alum Rock Avenue is a place that developers are licking their chops over because relatively the land is inexpensive. And so there's an opportunity for developers to come in and make a lot of money. And so there's going to be a wave of development that comes into the east side. But the city's going to walk away from that. They're going to pool their investment dollars to put it in other parts of town. And in fact, it's true. This is a community that is, generally speaking, low income. All the more reason to invest in housing in this community, because people choose to live here, not just because they're stuck here, but because there are cultural assets to living on the east side that people appreciate, and they choose to live on the east side, and they want to continue to live on the east side. But if the city is pulling its investment, then it's going to be harder and harder for people to remain on the east side, because what's happening is free market investment is coming into the east side. And that free market investment is going to displace working poor people. And that's been happening for decades. It's accelerating now. And what's going to happen over time, that just like the city of San Francisco, San Jose is going to be a place where only high income people can live. And poor people are going to have to move out of the city, and they're going to have to commute to do the jobs that only poor people can do. And so what we're saying is, no, let's preserve the working class communities here on the east side in this particular case. let's preserve the right for them to continue to live here and contribute to the community in the way that they do on an everyday basis. Let's not just dispose of them, build new housing, build new market rate housing, and bring in whole new populations, probably Google people, who are going to then take the place of the working class people who live out here right now. The so-called siting policy, as it's written right now, is going to be a big problem for revitalization of communities, just like the Alum Urban Village, but just like the East Side and all working poor communities in San Jose. So again, we'll talk a little bit more about this in a minute. The city is still considering this policy. And so there's still an opportunity to influence the city to change their minds and change direction right now. And I'm here to say that we really need your help on that. Last thing I'll say is just that nonprofit communities are very influential in City Hall. And so when nonprofit communities get together and work arm in arm to advance a cause, we've shown that we can make a big difference. And this is siting policy is one area where the nonprofit community can make a big difference. Thank you. Elma, if you want to chime in.
Just that affordable housing throughout the city is a good idea, but not area. And that's where we've fallen, that it's good to have affordable housing everywhere, fine, but not if it takes resources away from us, because we still have great needs here and we choose to live in these things. Thank you.
If I could just jump in, I'd mentioned earlier where you can see, how the stigmas are just dominating the policy debates. This is exactly an example where it came in. I sat through these meetings and we saw what was driving it, from the council members who proposed it to some of the neighbor activists, were this concern that affordable housing is this horrible thing. So of course we need to spread it around this community, where I think many of us know here, it is a life-saving, it's health, it's all the things that we need for our community. So it's just another little way where you can see this framing, these narratives, these fear-based arguments can drive people down a direction that is just not going to make sense for what our community needs.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to get to kind of what we can do, and I may queued it up really well, but I just want to, I can't help myself. I want to go back to something that Jaime said is I think, one of the real challenges is that sometimes folks on the outside, can't imagine that everybody doesn't want to live, next to them. and like that somehow everybody's life's going to be improved if they just got more white, wealthy neighbors. And I think it's really important, Jaime, to continue to, just speak to the reality of the fact that community is more than just, how much your neighbor makes. And so, we really need to confront that as part of the solution. Rather than changing communities, we have to figure out how to support them. And I really appreciate that comment. So I want to just open it up. We've a little bit of doom and gloom. Jaime's kind of rallied us a little bit, but I'm wondering, and maybe, David, if you have thoughts to start, or Thomas, what do we do in these situations where, we're getting this language and this perspective from our leaders, and what's our role in responding to this? Sometimes we talk about solutions, but I think maybe in this case, it's not so much solutions, but the actual advocacy and action opportunities to push back against this narrative.
Sure, I'd be happy to share some thoughts, but I'd love to hear what Thomas said, or Jaime, I saw you had your hand up, so I'm happy to go after you guys.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to add something too. I think it's important, again, there's still a chance to influence this, but I also think it's been called out earlier in general about racist policies. But I think it's important to really take a look at the assumptions that are being made with the siting policy. One of the assumptions that isn't talked about a lot is the fact that this policy is based on the assumption that, like, working poor people of color will be better off living with higher income white people in other parts of town. That's what's going to make their lives better. And that's an entirely racist and classist assumption that is being made. And that's what underlies this policy. And so again, I mean, it's surprising because some of our allies in the city and on the city council are proposing this, but they're not recognizing that theory is just completely backward, right? And so again, there's just another element in here that frankly just pisses me off, and I hope it does you as well. And that's the thing that motivates you to get involved in this call to action.
And I'd add, I think one of the things that's important is that people get out there. Like, you know, the big issue is that the people that are against a lot of these projects, a lot of the projects that have good potential and could really help people, they're well organized. You know, they get the word out, they get there to the meetings, you know, they come in, and give professional speeches about why they shouldn't have this. They have statistics, whether the statistics are complete crap or not, nobody even cares. It's just that it just sounds great when it's up there in front of everybody. You know, the fact is that what we need to do is make sure that when these meetings are taking place, when these discussions are happening, you know, that we as a community get together, put together a large group and go down there and say, you know, this is who we are. And, you know, this is, you know, this stereotype and the stigma that your guys are trying to place, you know, on the community is not the facts. And we just need to get out there and put the word out and be as well organized, if not more so, than those, you know, the not in my backyard type people are. So thank you.
Yeah, go ahead, David.
I was just going to back up what Thomas and Jaime both said. I mean, right, we need to get involved. Jaime made the point of nonprofits. When we come together, it is very powerful. You know, I think we remain, we have a certain credibility, right, from not only the on-the-ground experience we have from serving people we serve, but our own rich data and information we have. So we have to figure out how we can utilize that to inform these policy decisions, and whether it's very micro issue like the citing policy, other things we get into, but also how we're pushing back or informing this broader narrative, because these myths and stereotypes, they stick, and they stick because they're easy. It's easy for people to believe it. And so, you know, I'm under illusions that's going to be easy, but by us speaking up, we're going to change minds all over the place, but we have to start somewhere. And whether it's trying to be, you know, more public about it, we're playing around with stuff at Destination Home, how we have better educational resources, or how maybe we be more aggressive with our public messaging. But I also think just as powerful is when we have those opportunities to talk directly to elected officials who may be either misinformed or intentionally, you know, spreading the bad information, to let them know what the truth is, and can we either get them to do the right thing or let them know we're watching. That's important. But not just elected officials, other stakeholders, people out there. So it's as much about those relationships and how we're interacting one-on-one. I think they can have value as much as what we're doing with our larger microphones.
Great. Elma, you had your hand up.
You know, I also believe the city has a lot of conflicting policies. On one hand, they are accepting in lieu fees from the developer, so they don't build affordable housing in other parts of the city. And then with this policy, they're trying to correct supposedly a wrong of segregating affordable housing in just one area by distributing to all of the city. Well, if they weren't accepting in lieu fees from developers and forcing them to develop affordable housing as part of their development throughout the city, they wouldn't have made a corrective action. So it's all these conflicting policies that I see that no one really is looking at the big picture when they're making policies like this. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Aaron, I saw you unmuted. I don't want to cut you off. We're going to take just a couple of questions after. Did you have something you wanted to add?
I'll just be quick in that I think these movements need to be tenant and community driven, and nonprofits as a partner in that, but that it needs to be led by tenants who are organizing on the ground and for their communities.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, there are so many challenges, Elma, that there are these overlapping policies, and there are, I would just say, having sat through a couple of these discussions and have, you know, my text blow up, but about how everybody's angry. Oh my God, I can't believe they just said that. That's really messed up, and that's sort of racist. And but nobody was saying it in that space, right? Folks, colleagues somehow didn't have the courage to stand up and say, you know what, I don't want to talk about the details of your statistics. I want to point out that the language you're using is stigmatizing and racist and has an ugly tone and an ugly past and is really, degrading this conversation that we're trying to have. So I wish I was always as confident as I needed to be to step into that space, but I think that's something we can collectively commit to. So I was looking at the chat. I didn't see a whole lot of questions that came in. Did we want to ask people to raise hands? I have a couple of questions that came in ahead of the session. Why don't, because I can't see anybody. Can I have somebody from SVCN help me identify if there are any hands raised with questions or comments? Okay, why don't I go to the some of the questions that came in ahead of time. The best ones, which I don't know that we have an answer to, but maybe somebody has perspective on this, is, how do we do this differently? Like, are there examples of places or strategies that have been more effective? I have some comments on this, but I'm curious if anybody else feels like they have input on that particular question. Where have we done this better? Are there any lessons learned?
I mean, this is kind of going off of what everyone just said, but I guess to expand upon that, I mean, nothing, I forget exactly how the quote goes, but like, the oppressor doesn't give you the tools to take down their oppression. You're not going to be given that, and you have to demand it for yourself. And one thing that I often think about in doing my work is that the first rent regulation laws in the country coming out of New York City came out of massive rent strikes that were organized all across the city. And that led to some of the first rent regulation laws. And that wouldn't have happened had people not organized and were willing to take extreme measures and to take and use tactics that directly confront the profit motive behind housing and to directly confront those in power, like landlords, like developers. So I just wanted to kind of add that to give a real world example of what we're saying, and that people need to organize and take action.
Okay, point well taken. I think this is a good group. I'm looking at multiple screens of folks who are committed enough to show up and listen. And I think Erin's asking us to support community efforts to respond. And Jaime is pointing out that we actually all have a significant role to play. So I know that we're gonna work to keep people informed, Jaime, and we'll coordinate with Kira to make sure that people know when this policy is coming back. I also know that we are in election season, and even though that's crazy making in many ways, it also provides opportunities for us to address elected officials and candidates directly and ask them what they can do, what is their role in counteracting the stigmatization of working poor communities and residents of affordable housing and folks that are unhoused and looking for humane support as they struggle to make it through each day. Like there's no limit to what we should and could be doing. So pay attention, look for the opportunities to attend candidate forums, ask tough questions. I think, as Erin pointed out, figuring out how to make sure that we're supporting organizing efforts and that we're coming together around common messaging is really important. Was there a question that I missed in the chat? The chat is starting to move. I'm really bad at monitoring the chat and talking at the same time. Let me, because we are very close to time, let me just acknowledge that this is the beginning of a discussion. I really appreciate the Center for Nonprofits for sponsoring this discussion and frankly having the courage to bring us together to talk about this, because we often miss this piece when we're talking about policy and what we can do. And I think it's really valuable to begin these discussions so that we can make sure that this doesn't get lost. Let me thank everybody. David Lowe from Destination Home, Thomas Knight from Destination Home and the Lived Experience Board, Aaron Neff from the Law Foundation, Elma Arredondo and Jaime Alvarado from Aruva. Thank you everybody for being here. I'm going to turn it over to staff now, but this is the beginning, not the end of the conversation.